Picture it, a bitter January night in 1457. Snow is driving against the stone walls of Pembroke Castle, the Atlantic winds rattling the shutters as if trying to break them from their hinges. Within those walls, in a chamber lit only by guttering candles and the orange flare of a hearth, a 13-year-old girl lies writhing in agony. Her screams echo through the corridors, half child, half woman. Her body convulsing under a burden it was never built to endure. That girl is Lady Margaret Beaufort, and the life she is fighting to bring into the world will one day change the destiny of England. The sheets are soaked, her hands clutching at the coarse linen until her knuckles turn white. The midwives hover like sentinels, their voices weaving prayers in Latin as though sheer devotion might persuade heaven to intervene. One burns sprigs of lavender and rosemary against the smoke-choked air, the acrid scent mingling with sweat and blood. Outside, snow carpets the cliffs and fields of Pembrokeshire, a silence broken only by the relentless Atlantic waves crashing below. But within these walls there is nothing but sound, the groaning, the cries, the whispered confessions that tonight might end in death. To understand the peril of this moment, one must understand childbirth in the 15th century. Even for grown women, bearing a child was a gamble with death. 1 in 3 did not survive repeated pregnancies. For Margaret, barely into adolescence, the danger was magnified. Her hips had not yet widened, her body was still growing, and her bones were not prepared for the strain of labor. Contemporary physicians, bound by the ancient texts of Galen more than by practical science, had little to offer beyond herbs, hot irons, and prayers. Midwives knew their craft through inherited wisdom, but even they looked grim as they checked the child's position inside Margaret's too small frame. Hours pass, she grows weaker, her voice cracking until only low gasps escape her lips. The midwives exchange glances heavy with dread. They know this sight, a child forced to birth a child, a collision of politics and biology that often ended with 2 funerals. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother and now Margaret's protector, paces in the corridors outside. Each scream from within is like a blade twisting into his ribs. He knows, too, what is at stake. For the fragile Lancastrian cause reeling from defeats, beset by Yorkist rivals, this child is a flicker of hope. If he is born alive, he may one day carry their banner. If both he and his mother die, the cause will dim to darkness. Midwives and physician press on. They attempt to turn the baby, a maneuver as perilous as it is desperate. They administer concoctions of pennyroyal and rue, herbs that promise to quicken contractions but just as easily exhaust a fragile body. They whisper invocations to St. Margaret of Antioch, patron saint of women in labor, whose legend tells of surviving the belly of a dragon. If anyone needs a miracle, it is this girl child who bears the blood of John of Gaunt yet lies on the brink of death. At last, as the night edges toward dawn, Margaret's body yields, with one final tearing effort, half courage, half compulsion of nature. The infant emerges, pale and silent. For an instant, time holds its breath. The midwife clears his tiny mouth, rubs his back, and then at last an infant's cry pierces the chamber. Then, ragged, angry, but unmistakably alive, the women exhale, some with tears in their eyes. They swaddle him quickly, but before he is carried to the fire they place him for one brief moment against his mother's chest. Margaret, half conscious, forces her heavy eyelids open. Her hand trembles as she tries to touch the tiny face. She has no strength left. Her body has been torn, damaged in ways the physician already knows can never fully heal. At 13, she has borne the only child she will ever have, but she does not know this yet. All she knows is the heat of his skin against hers and the echo of that first cry. They name him Henry Tudor, a frail child born from the breaking of his mother, destined to one day wear the crown of England. Outside, the storm continues, snowflakes whirling over the battlements, wind howling through the cracks of the fortress. To the people of Wales, it is just another brutal winter's night. But in the dark chamber of Pembroke Castle, history has shifted, for out of suffering that no child should endure, a dynasty has been born, the dynasty that will end decades of civil war and carve a new path for England. Margaret does not yet know the scale of the sacrifice demanded of her, but the die is cast. Her body is broken, her spirit tested, and her destiny sealed in blood and pain. This is how the Tudor age begins, not with a coronation, not with a victory in battle, but with a girl's scream carried out over the sea winds of Wales. To understand the weight upon Margaret Beaufort's young shoulders, one must trace the veins through which her blood ran. She was born in May 1443 at Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire, the daughter of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp. Through her father, she carried the blood of John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III, and thus a direct line to the throne of England. In another time, this lineage might have been a blessing, a path to honor and power, but in 15th century, England fractured, suspicious, and teetering on the brink of civil war, it was as dangerous as a brand seared into the skin. Royal blood made you valuable, yes, but also expendable. It marked you as either a pawn to be played or a threat to be eliminated. Her father, John Beaufort, was no ordinary noble. He had once commanded the armies of England and France during the waning years of the 100 Years' War, but those campaigns were disastrous. He watched strongholds crumble, English prestige disintegrate, and the conquests of Henry V slip away like sand through open fingers. By the time he returned to England in 1444, he was a man hollowed out by failure. Courtiers whispered of his trembling hands, his vacant stare, and his silence at feasts where once he had spoken proudly of honor. On May 27th of that same year, he was found dead in his chambers at Wimborne Minster. The official record called it fever, but few believed it. Some said despair drove him to his own end. Others, in a world where every noble death raised suspicions, whispered of poison. Whatever the truth, his passing left his infant daughter fatherless, her inheritance both a prize and a curse. For Margaret's mother, the widowed Duchess Margaret Beauchamp, survival meant swift calculation. In this world, a woman's security lay in alliances, and alliances were sealed not with treaties but with marriages. Her daughter's bloodline made her precious to be wasted. By the time Margaret was 6, she was already betrothed to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk. A little girl still playing with wooden dolls had been signed into the destiny of dynastic politics. It is hard to imagine Margaret at that age, a small child running through the gardens of Bletsoe Castle, her laughter echoing off the grey stone walls, unaware that in the eyes of the realm she was already spoken for. The betrothal tied her to one of the most powerful families in England. But power in those days was fragile, as unstable as the crown itself. In 1450, Suffolk fell spectacularly from grace, accused of treachery for surrendering the French provinces of Maine and Anjou. He became the scapegoat for years of failure. Abroad, the common people despised him, the nobles plotted against him, and the king could no longer protect him, as he attempted to flee across the Channel. He was seized by men who claimed to be pirates, but were almost certainly assassins. They dragged him onto the deck, forced him to kneel, and hacked off his head with a rusty sword. It took 6 blows to sever it. His body was tossed into the sea, and with him, Margaret's engagement dissolved into nothing more than ink on parchment. For the Beaufort women, the lesson was stark. Survival meant adaptability. If one alliance failed, another must be forged before enemies could strike. Noble girls were commodities in this brutal marketplace of politics, their youth and innocence irrelevant compared to the weight of their ancestry. Margaret learned this early, watching her mother navigate the treacherous currents of court politics, remarrying, securing lands, and bargaining for her daughter's future. The young girl may not yet have understood the stakes, but she absorbed the lesson. In a world ruled by men and swords, a woman's power lay in foresight, patience, and the ability to bend without breaking. And so the stage was set. Margaret, heir to a tainted but potent legacy, marked by tragedy before she was out of childhood, would soon be thrust into the jaws of dynastic marriage once more. The next match, arranged with ruthless pragmatism, would bind her to a family of Welship starts with royal favor, the Tudors, a union that promised protection and connection, but would demand from her a price far greater than childhood innocence. It would demand her body, her safety, and nearly her life. In the spring of 1455, while England itself lurched towards civil war, 12-year-old Margaret Beaufort was led into a marriage she could scarcely comprehend. Her new husband was Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, half-brother to King Henry VI. Edmund was in his mid-20s, battle-hardened, politically seasoned, a man of ambition and experience. Margaret was barely out of the nursery. The union was not born of love but of politics. For the Tudors, Welsh-born and still viewed with suspicion by many of the English nobility. Marrying Margaret meant acquiring legitimacy through her Beaufort blood. For Margaret's guardians, the match meant proximity to the crown. For Margaret herself, it meant the end of childhood. The wedding took place at Bletsoe Castle, the same halls where Margaret had toddled as a child. Tapestries depicting her Beaufort ancestors lined the great chamber, their woven faces staring down like silent witnesses. The vows were spoken in Latin, solemn words that Margaret could repeat but not fully understand. To the guests, it was a grand event, proof of dynastic strength. To the bride, it was bewildering. She was dressed in fine cloth, her hair braided and crowned with a circlet, yet her hands trembled. Accounts do not tell us what she thought or felt. History often silences women, but one imagines the mixture of fear and resignation that hung in the air as she whispered her assent. In the 15th century, such unions were not unusual. Noble girls were married off in their early teens, their bodies seen as vessels for heirs rather than as fragile, growing forms. The concept of waiting for maturity was alien. Dynastic urgency trumped nature. Chroniclers tell us the marriage was consummated immediately. For Margaret, it was an experience of trauma that she never spoke of in later life, but whose consequences were carved into her body forever. Within months, her belly began to swell, her body straining under the weight of pregnancy before it had even finished growing. Those around her spoke in hushed voices, torn between joy at the prospect of an heir and fear for the fragile girl carrying him. Edmund Tudor, meanwhile, was already swept into the violence of the time, the Wars of the Roses. Dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York were erupting. Edmund, a staunch Lancastrian, campaigned across Wales to defend his king's cause. In 1456, only a year after his marriage, he was captured by Yorkist forces and taken to Carmarthen Castle. The details of his death remain shrouded in rumor. Some said plague took him, a common and convenient explanation in the filth of medieval prisons. Others whispered that he was deliberately neglected or even murdered outright, a victim of political vengeance. Whatever the cause, by November of 1456 Edmund was dead. For Margaret, the news arrived like a thunderclap. She was 13 years old, widowed, and heavily pregnant. A child herself, she now carried not only her unborn son but also the fragile hopes of a dynasty. Her situation was perilous. Without Edmund, she was vulnerable, a political pawn without protector. In that moment of loss, the world must have felt unbearably vast and hostile. And yet, fate placed another guardian in her path, Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, who stepped forward to shield his sister-in-law. It was not only an act of duty but also one of political necessity. Within Margaret's womb lay the future of their line, a potential heir who might yet restore Lancastrian fortunes. Thus Margaret, bereft and frightened, was moved under Jasper's protection to the windswept stronghold of Pembroke Castle in Wales. There, amid stone walls battered by sea winds, she would endure the ordeal of childbirth that nearly killed her and forever altered her destiny. When Edmund Tudor's death left her widowed, -1-year-old Margaret Beaufort was moved under the guardianship of his younger brother Jasper. The decision was both pragmatic and protective. Margaret carried the only hope of Tudor legacy inside her frail body, and Jasper, loyal, calculating, and deeply tied to his family, understood the value of that life. He brought her to Pembroke Castle, his stronghold on the western coast of Wales, a fortress that clung to cliffs above the restless waters of Milford Haven. If the world beyond was collapsing into civil war, then here, behind walls of stone, the Tudor heir might be preserved. The journey itself was punishing. Roads in winter were scarcely more than rutted tracks, frozen and treacherous. Margaret traveled in a litter jolted over icy ground, every bump sending pain through her small, swelling body. The trip stretched for days as flooded rivers and fallen trees forced detours. Bands of armed men, loyal to Lancaster or York depending on the weak, stalked the countryside. Each mile carried the risk of ambush or worse. By the time she arrived at Pembroke, Exhausted and pale, she had endured more than most women twice her age. Pembroke Castle was no gentle refuge. Its great round keep towered nearly 80 feet high, a relic of Norman conquest, built not for comfort but survival. And winter, its chambers were cold and drafty, the wind slipping through every crack no matter how many tapestries were hung to block it. Fires devoured would yet barely warm the stone. Margaret's rooms were damp, sea air clinging to everything. In such conditions, even the strongest would falter. For a child carrying a child, it was a crucible. Jasper provided what protection he could. He oversaw her care, ensured she had attendance, and summoned a physician, Louis Carlion, educated at Oxford and Paris, respected in both court and university circles. But even Carlion's learning faltered before the reality of Margaret's body. Her pelvis was too narrow, her growth incomplete. He whispered to Jasper that childbirth might kill her. They could attempt interventions turning the baby, herbal concoctions, even the near-suicidal option of surgery, but each carried deadly risks. The choices were bleak. The mother might die, the child might die, or both. Margaret herself understood more than she let on. She was no ordinary girl, even then. Those who attended her recorded her composure, the way she prayed for hours in the chapel, her knees raw against the flagstones, lips murmuring Latin invocations. She began to cultivate a relationship with God that was less girlish devotion and more pact of survival. Some historians see in this the roots of her lifelong religious intensity. To Margaret, faith was not an abstract. It was the anchor in a life storm tossed by forces she could not control. January of 1457 brought the climax of her ordeal. Walking slowly along the battlements to take the exercise prescribed by Carlion, a sudden pain seized her. The contractions began, merciless and unrelenting. Her attendants hurried her back to her chambers, where midwives prepared for what they already feared would be a dangerous birth. Among them was Gwenfert Dafydd, a Welsh midwife with decades of experience, carrying the inherited wisdom of generations of women. She burned herbs for strength and calm, laid out her instruments, knives, hooks, cloths, holy relics, and whispered to Saint Margaret of Antioch for intercession. For 18 hours, Margaret labored. The sound carried through the castle, screams, groans, prayers shouted into the cold air. Servants rushed with basins of hot water. Jasper paced outside the heavy oak door, and Father Meredith, the castle priest, knelt in the chapel begging heaven's mercy. Inside, it was a battle of flesh and spirit. The midwives tried every technique they knew, changing her position, massaging her abdomen, murmuring encouragement. Margaret's small body seemed to break under the strain, her skin turning pale as parchment, her voice eventually reduced to hoarse gasps. At dawn, with her strength nearly gone, Gwen made the desperate choice to attempt manual extraction. It was dangerous, brutal, but there was no alternative. Whispering prayers as she worked, she guided the child out into the world. For one terrible moment, silence. The baby lay limp, slick with blood, seemingly lifeless. Then Gwen cleared his mouth and struck his back, and a thin, ragged cry split the air. The sound was like the shattering of chains. The boy lived. They placed him on his mother's chest. Margaret, drenched in sweat, her body torn and broken, forced her eyes open. Through a haze of agony she saw him, tiny, furious, alive, Henry, the heir she had nearly died to bring forth. Her arms trembled as she tried to hold him, but exhaustion overcame her. The midwives swept him away to swaddle by the fire, while the physician turned back to Margaret, whose life still hung by a thread. She would survive, though at great cost. The tearing was extensive, the damage permanent. At 13, her body was left incapable of bearing another child. The birth had taken from her not only her innocence but her fertility. She had given England a son and in doing so, had sacrificed herself. Yet from this sacrifice a dynasty would rise, out of blood and suffering. The Tudor line had its beginning. In Pembroke Castle, the waves kept crashing against the cliffs, as they always had, but inside those ancient walls, the cries of a newborn mingled with the sobs of a half-dead mother, announcing that history had just changed course. The girl who survived that night at Pembroke Castle was no longer the same child who had entered it. Margaret Beaufort's body was left permanently altered by her ordeal. Dr. Louis Carlion, the learned physician, recorded his grim conclusion. She would never bear another child. At 13, she had given England the future Henry VII, and with that single act, her childbearing years were already over. The damage was irreversible. For most noblewomen of her era, the ability to produce heirs was their central role, their bargaining power. For Margaret, the irony was brutal. She had fulfilled that duty once, yet in doing so, had destroyed the possibility of ever doing so again. Her recovery was slow and tortuous. Fever racked her body, and infection lingered, as it so often did. In the aftermath of childbirth, the midwives spooned broth past her cracked lips, praying she would live. In those weeks, Margaret's religiosity deepened into something approaching obsession. She prayed not just for survival, but for meaning that her suffering might be part of some divine plan. In her later years, she would be known as one of the most pious women of her time. Funding colleges, translating devotional works, and shaping the spiritual fabric of Tudor England. But its roots lay here, in the agony of a broken body, turning to God because no earthly force could make sense of such pain. Even as she healed, politics did not pause. England was sliding deeper into civil conflict. By 1455, the Wars of the Roses had begun in earnest, Yorkists and Lancastrians clashing for control of the throne. For Margaret, a young widow with a newborn heir, survival meant finding protection. Jasper Tudor remained her son's guardian, raising young Henry at Pembroke. But for Margaret herself, another marriage was deemed necessary. A lone girl, even one of royal blood, could not stand alone in such a treacherous world. In 1458, she married Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. This second union could not have been more different from her first, where Edmund Tudor had been ambitious, eager to secure his place in dynastic politics. Henry Stafford was more cautious, even pragmatic. The match was designed less for romance and more for survival. Stafford was a Yorkist sympathizer, which at first glance seemed an odd choice for a woman so deeply tied to the Lancastrian cause. But the arrangement brought her protection, land, security, and most importantly time. For Margaret, still weak and scarred, it was less a marriage of hearts than a contract of necessity. The wedding itself was subdued, lacking the grand pageantry that had accompanied her earlier union. Margaret, barely 15, walked to the altar with the quiet composure of someone far older. If she grieved, if she feared, she did not show it. She had already learned the lesson that defined her life. Survival demanded adaptability. If her first marriage had thrust her into trauma, her second would cloak her in caution. Meanwhile, her son Henry remained in Jasper Tudor's care. This arrangement was practical but agonizing. Margaret saw him rarely, sometimes only once or twice a year. She wrote letters, sent gifts, small books, clothing, tokens of a mother's love, but her boy was growing into a stranger. Raised in the Welsh Hills, surrounded by soldiers and retainers, he learned to ride, to fight, to survive in a land of divided loyalties. Margaret could only watch from afar, her maternal instincts sharpened by absence. Each letter, each report of his health, was both a lifeline and a wound. As years passed, Margaret grew into her role as Stafford's wife. She managed estates with keen intelligence, studied law and scripture with almost monastic intensity, and cultivated a reputation for wisdom. Beneath it all, however, was the constant ache of separation from her son and the gnawing awareness that England's wars could sweep him away at any moment. Each change in fortune at court, each shift in battle, could spell danger for the boy whose very existence was both a threat and a promise. For Margaret, the 1460s were years of an easy balanced partnership with a Yorkist husband, loyalty to a Lancastrian son, and a private faith that sustained her through the contradictions. She played the part of obedient wife and noblewoman, but within her heart a deeper resolve was taking root. The girl who had been pawned in marriage and broken in childbirth was learning the subtler arts of survival, patience, calculation, and the slow, deliberate weaving of alliances. She was preparing, though perhaps she did not yet realize it, for a life that would demand every ounce of strategy and endurance she possessed. The 1460s and early 1470s were years when England bled itself dry. Margaret Beaufort, though still young, had become a quiet witness to some of the bloodiest chapters in English history. From her manor houses and carefully cultivated alliances She watched the tides of war shift back and forth, sweeping away kings, nobles, and entire families. Each turn of fortune brought new dangers for her son Henry, hidden away in Wales under Jasper Tudor's protection, and new challenges for Margaret as she walked the knife's edge between survival and loyalty. The most terrible of these upheavals came in 1461, at the Battle of Towton. On Palm Sunday, March 29th, under driving snow, more than 50,000 men clashed on a Yorkshire field. By nightfall, nearly half lay dead. Chroniclers describe the streams running red with blood, corpses stacked like firewood, and wounded men trampled. As armies pressed forward, it remains the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. For Margaret, Towton's significance was clear. The Lancastrian cause was broken. King Henry VI fled to Scotland, his Queen Margaret of Anjou into exile in France, and the victorious Edward IV claimed the throne for York. In the aftermath, Margaret's Lancastrian blood made her suspect, her young son a dangerous symbol of resistance, yet she endured. Part of her survival came from her husband, Henry Stafford. Though once loyal to York, he began to grow disillusioned after years of costly service and scant reward. Wounded at Edgecote in 1469, his thigh slashed open in battle, Stafford never fully recovered. The injury left him crippled, bitter, and more receptive to the subtle influence of his wife. Margaret, ever cautious, never spoke openly of rebellion. Instead, she nurtured his resentment, planting doubts about Edward IV's leadership, murmuring of corruption, incompetence, and betrayal. Slowly, Stafford began to lean away from York, even as he remained careful not to provoke outright suspicion. For Margaret, this was the art of survival, quiet persuasion, quiet patience. She could not wield a sword, but she could read the currents of politics with growing skill. She wrote careful letters, cultivated ties with women on both sides of the conflict, and cloaked herself in piety that disarmed suspicion. In private, however, her thoughts circled always back to her son. Every rumor of unrest in Wales, every report of Yorkist patrols near Pembroke, filled her with dread. If Henry were discovered, he could be executed as a pretender before he was even grown. The storm broke in 1471. The Earl of Warwick, the mighty kingmaker who had once raised Edward IV to power, turned against him and allied with Margaret of Anjou to restore Henry VI. For a moment, it seemed Lancastrian fortunes might revive, but Edward moved swiftly, returning from exile with Burgundian support. At Barnet in April, Warwick was killed, his rebellion shattered. 2 weeks later, at Tewkesbury, the Lancastrians met their final ruin. Edward of Westminster, Henry VI's only son, was slain, whether in the melee or executed after capture remains disputed. Within weeks, Henry VI himself was dead in the Tower of London. Some whispered he was murdered, smothered on Edward IV's orders. What mattered was that the direct Lancastrian line was extinguished out suddenly. The boy hidden in Wales, Margaret's Henry, was the last significant heir of Lancaster. That made him both precious and doomed. Yorkist eyes turned toward him, calculating the risk of leaving such a claimant alive. Jasper Tudor, recognizing the danger, made a desperate choice: exile. Better to send the boy abroad than risk his capture on English soil. And so, on a storm-lashed night in September 1471, 14-year-old Henry boarded a ship at Tenby and sailed into the unknown, bound for Brittany. Margaret was not there to see him go. The decision had been made in haste, the opportunity snatched before Yorkist forces closed in. Days later, when word reached her, the shock was crushing. 4 years she had endured separation, comforted by the thought that her son was at least within the same kingdom. Now he was across the channel, pawn in foreign courts, vulnerable to every disease, every accident, every intrigue. She could not know if she would ever see him again. In that moment of grief, something hardened within her. The girl who had once prayed for survival now prayed for strategy. If she could not protect her son by holding him close, she would protect him by outmaneuvering her enemies. If she could not be a mother in the ordinary sense, she would become something else: a political architect, a patient conspirator, a woman whose every calculation was bent toward one end: the return of her son to England, not as exile but as king. Henry Stafford, weakened by his wound, died later that same year. To some, The timing seemed cruelly convenient, as though fate were stripping Margaret of every shelter until she stood alone. To others, it seemed providential. Freed from the caution of her Yorkist husband, she could now devote herself entirely to her son's cause, whatever the truth. Margaret emerged from 1471 transformed, no longer merely the child mother who had survived Pembroke, no longer the cautious wife maneuvering in her husband's shadow. She was now a political player in her own right. Widowed twice, scarred in body and soul, she began to weave the webs of intrigue that would, in time, alter the crown itself. And so, while Henry Tudor began his long exile in the Duchy of Brittany, Margaret Beaufort began her long game in England. Across the Channel stretched not just a sea, but 14 years of separation, 14 years of letters coded and smuggled, of networks built and rebuilt, of plots begun and crushed. 14 years in which a mother and her son would live apart, yet never cease to shape one another's destinies. Widowed once more in 1471, Margaret Beaufort stood at a crossroads. She could have retreated into obscurity, content to guard her estates and pray for her exiled son from a safe distance. But Margaret was not fashioned for passivity. She understood that in the brutal politics of 15th century England, survival meant not only patience but strategy. And so, she made the choice that would define the next phase of her life. She remarried. Not for protection or affection, but for power. Third husband was Thomas Stanley, one of the most seasoned political survivors of the age. Stanley had perfected the art of backing the winning side, switching loyalties with exquisite timing so that he always emerged intact, if not enriched. His family commanded vast forces in the Northwest. His influence reached into every noble household, and his reputation was that of a man who could decide battles without drawing a sword. For Margaret, aligning with him meant access to intelligence, soldiers, and a shield of political protection. For Stanley, the marriage bound him to Beaufort blood, a connection that carried weight even in exile. It was a union of convenience, cold but effective. From this position, Margaret began weaving her webs of intrigue. She cultivated networks that stretched from Westminster to the merchant ports of the continent. She employed servants, clerks, and even priests as informants. Letters were written in code, invisible ink, or hidden inside seemingly innocent correspondence. Merchants carried news across the Channel, and pilgrims smuggled messages to her son in Brittany. She became, in effect, a stateswoman without a throne, quietly shaping the politics of England while outwardly performing the role of a dutiful noblewoman. The death of Edward IV in April 1483 changed everything. His heir, Edward V, was a child of 12. A boy king meant a regency, and regencies meant opportunity. But the boy never wore the crown. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized power, declaring the young Edward and his brother illegitimate, and locking them in the Tower of London. The boys disappeared, their fate never confessed, and Richard crowned himself as Richard III. To many, it was a coup draped in blood, and suspicion clung to his throne from the start. For Margaret, this was the opening she had been waiting for. Richard's usurpation tarnished the Yorkist cause, leaving a void of legitimacy. Into that void, Margaret thrust her son's claim. Henry Tudor was far removed from the direct Lancastrian line, his claim tenuous, shadowed by questions of legitimacy. Yet compared to a king suspected of murdering children, Henry's distant claim looked suddenly viable. Margaret began to act with audacity that startled even her allies. She reached out to exiles abroad, to bishops within England, even to Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen Dowager of Edward IV, whose daughters had been rendered politically homeless by Richard's coup. In a breathtaking maneuver, Margaret proposed a marriage, her son Henry to Elizabeth of York, uniting Lancaster and York in one bloodline. It was a masterstroke of strategy, a promise to end the war by binding the roses together. But such plotting was perilous. In October 1483, her schemes nearly cost her everything. A planned rebellion collapsed, exposed by betrayal. Margaret's allies were executed, their heads displayed on spikes. She was spared death only by her marriage to Stanley, who argued for clemency. Even so, she was placed under house arrest and stripped of titles. Yet confinement did not still her hand. Even in restraint, she continued to write, to plan, to prepare. Her faith in her son's destiny had become unshakable, as though she believed God himself had chosen Henry to redeem the blood-soaked land. 2 years later, in August 1485, her patience bore fruit. Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven, the very shores where he had once been born amid his mother's agony. He marched inland with a modest army, while Richard III gathered his forces. On the fields of Bosworth, the fate of England turned. Stanley, ever the pragmatist, had arrived with his men but held them back, watching the battle unfold. Then, at the decisive moment, he committed his troops not to Richard, whom he had served, but to Henry, his stepson. The betrayal was fatal. Richard fought ferociously, refusing to flee. But he was struck down in the mud, his crown seized and placed upon Henry's head. After 30 years of civil war, the Wars of the Roses ended not with a treaty but with a mother's long gamble paying off. Margaret Beaufort had achieved what seemed impossible. From a child widow at 13, from the blood-stained sheets of Pembroke, from decades of quiet suffering and political maneuvering, she had raised a king. Yet the victory came at a cost she could never recoup. She had spent most of her life separated from Henry, watching him grow through letters and whispers, never enjoying the ordinary intimacy of mother and son. When at last he returned, it was not as a boy to his mother but as a king to his greatest supporter. Their bond was real, but it was shaped more by destiny than by affection. Margaret lived to see her son crown Henry VII, married to Elizabeth of York, and father to the boy who would become Henry VIII. She walked the halls of court not as queen, but as the king's mother, the architect behind the dynasty that now ruled England. She endowed colleges, patronized the church, and left her mark on learning as much as on politics. Yet she never escaped the shadow of that night in 1457, when her body was broken so that a dynasty might be born. She died in 1509, just days after the coronation of her grandson. At Westminster Abbey, her tomb of black marble carries a Latin inscription that praises her piety and her works, but stone cannot capture the full truth. What lingers is not the carved words, but the echoes of a girl's scream in a Welsh castle, the scream of a child forced to become a mother, and in doing so, forced to become a strategist. That sound, carried on the sea winds, was the first cry of the Tudor age.